So first off, thank you to everyone who's joining us and welcome to another Talking About Design Salon. My name is Stephen Weiner and I'm joined here with Amanda Risky and Tim Wright of Attucks Adams. This is going to be a really fascinating talk. We're very excited to be discovering a little bit about really an area of education that we haven't really talked about on this channel, which is educational walking tours. So for those of you who have not joined us before, Talking About Design is a very eclectic, interdisciplinary community founded by a bunch of eccentric graduate students here at Arizona State University who are all interested in design, generally come from an education background, but are really interested in exploring all different conceptions of design and people who do design in different ways. So that's a little bit about us. And we are going to be having a conversation today, is what we do in these salons, with a special guest. Tim Wright is our special guest, and Amanda Risky is our special liaison, special guest who has known Tim a while and is going to introduce him.
Yeah, thank you for that, Stephen. So I met Tim in 2014 at Washington International School Summer Institute for Teachers. Tim gave an amazing presentation at the National Building Museum about these designing for disaster educational kits. Basically, they are about how modifications to buildings can aid buildings in weathering storms and natural disasters. We were both involved in the Project Zero in DC, in Washington, DC, and a big shout out to Jim Reese for connecting us there. And all that morphed into us discussing lessons and resources about transportation and decision-making around waiting for a train based on probabilities and access. I was teaching math at the time at Washington International School, and Tim came to see some of my lessons, and we problem solved around different aspects of transportation systems and decision-making. And I really appreciated his attention to the details of cities and how those details work together or don't work together to serve its residents. And this is also evident in his walking tours in DC, and I was lucky to go on 2 of them in person. And in some ways, I feel like this is a full circle because we met when you were working on designing for disaster. And now we are talking about design during national protests for calling for justice and dismantling systemic racism. We witness record-breaking storms and fires as symptoms of climate change and a global pandemic to boot. So in some ways we were designing for disaster when we first met, and now we are designing during disasters. So I just wanted to say that. And all in all, it's been a pleasure learning about your experience and your process these last months as we're preparing for this talk. And we're excited to learn more about your process and how you create these virtual tours. So we're just really excited to meet you in the space and talk to you. I lost my place and my introduction. But I just wanted to capture that you really reflect well on the built environment and what that means to individuals and to us as a society. So welcome. We are so excited to have you be here with us today.
Thank you, Amanda and Stephen and everyone at Talking About Design. I really appreciate it and looking forward to our talk and getting into it. Thank you for that amazing introduction.
Yeah, that was great, Amanda. And thank you, again, thank you, Tim. So for those of us who don't know you well as Amanda does, we want to get a little bit inside your head before, and we are excited you're going to give us a little kind of a mini virtual walking tour. But before that, we want to ask you, if you were not in, say, the pandemic times that we're now in, and you were going on an adventure to a new city that you had never been to, so you step out of the airport into this new city, what are some of the things that you might notice or look for, and particularly maybe things that other people might overlook?
Wow, yeah, great question. And yeah, of course, during pre-pandemic times, one of my most favorite things to do is visit other cities. Like, I appreciate beaches, I appreciate the mountains, I appreciate meadows, but when I travel, I like to go to cities. So I've done this often. Yeah, I think for me, wow, what do I look for? Since I live in Washington, DC, we have a sort of very unique layout and design, and so it's sort of my baseline. And that's sort of what I compare other cities to. So I'm always looking for places where people gather. That's one of the first things I look for, where people gather, whether that's downtown or in one of the neighborhoods or out in the suburbs, where do people naturally gather? Um, and I don't say this in a cynical way, but I also sort of look for like deficits, like what are impediments to people gathering, or what are impediments to people moving around, or when you get to the airport as a person without a car that rarely drives, I always want to figure out, how do I get to the hotel, or wherever, the conference, wherever I'm headed to. And in a lot of cities, it's very difficult to do that without a car. And sometimes it's difficult to do that with a car. So I'll immediately sort of go to these structural, ideas about how the city is made up, what it is made up of, and where people gather, how do they get there, and then how do I like join in on that. I'm always someone that wants to be, you know, like a local, as they say, but when I even to a place that's unknown to me that I've just shown up. So I think I sort of look for those higher level sort of structural things, but also just following where the people are. Because usually, if you find where the people gather, you're going to have a good time when you're in a new place.
Very cool. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. At some point, if you if you ever come out to Phoenix, you'll probably find some very interesting structural and infrastructure related things to look at it, and even like what we're trying to do to increase access to places like the airport. It's kind of interesting, but very different than DC for sure. Actually,
Yeah,
on that note, yeah, Amanda, do you want to lead us into the tour here?
yeah. So Tim is going to give us a little mini demo tour of a small portion of the U Street tour that he's done. It's about 10 minutes, so enjoy. But I think you need to unmute yourself, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and thank you. Yeah, I'll just do, so it's been so interesting as someone that's, I own a walking tour company, and it's, the tours were in the space of the city. And of course, now it's just sort of very difficult to gather with other people, even outside. And so I'm not able to do as many as I used to. So it's been a real challenge sort of figure out how to design an experience that is analogous to, but different from the actual walking tour, but the same content, like the same neighborhood. So this is just a little tiny snippet of one of walking tours I had that's on near U Street, Washington, D.C., and you'll see a little bit how I've transitioned that walking tour and made it into sort of a virtual experience. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll just do about 10 minutes of this, and you'll just get a little taste of what we have here. All right. So first, I did actually want to involve you, Amanda. I know you just handed it off to me, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, so this is a mural that we look at on the tour a little bit later, but I wanted to start off with this one because part of the experience having someone learn about this neighborhood is having them like giving opportunities for guest discovery, so for guests to discover something in what they're looking at. So this is one of the murals that we look at, and I just have a question for you, Amanda. We're just looking at this. What do you notice about the image that you see, or what stands out about the image?
The main thing is the man in it, but also a lot of movement. Like it looks like there's piano keys and there's something like resembling speakers and pencils, and they're moving away from him. And if I look closer, I notice like a record player with the needle even, like, so there's part of a record player.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, sorry. But yeah.
That's great. So yeah, this is the tour is about this area of Washington, D.C. that used to be known as Black Broadway. And so to bring that story alive, I've sort of created a narrative about the people that used to live there, the buildings that were there and are there. And some of that history has been captured in murals. And so one of the things that the guests can do is discover sort of this history by looking through murals. So some of the things you mentioned when you were just observing this, even for just 30 seconds, you notice some of the main elements, like there's a lot of movement. We don't have much context about who this person is that's pictured, but you notice there was a piano, a record player, there were some speakers. the person's holding a microphone, so you could probably guess it's a musician. And you're exactly right. This is Marvin Gaye, one of the most top 2 or 3 musical children of Washington D.C. And so throughout the tour, we can leverage this artwork to draw people into history. Just looking a little bit more at this mural, you're right, like that movement, the arrows, the artist Anagon, you see his name up in the top left corner. His idea was he was trying to put music into a visual, which I could totally see that in this image. He said he was trying to show Marvin Gaye hitting a high note in the image, which I totally appreciate. One thing we didn't touch on, but is sort of right there, is those pencils that are in it. And that to me is also very interesting. The artist, the muralist, his idea is if you're any kind of creative person, a songwriter, a novelist, architect, engineer, a poet, the first instrument you pick up is going to be a pencil. So I totally appreciate that. One of the things about using these murals as teaching tools on the tour is, in some ways, they're sort of ephemeral. Like they're not meant to last forever. And this mural actually was the second Marvin Gaye mural that the artist had done. So if we were looking at this mural, which is on S Street, S as in Snake, in Washington, D.C., Northwest, and we turned around, we would see the site of the former mural. So this is the second mural he did. Here's the first one that he did that was right across the street. And this is an image of the artist standing in front of the old mural on the day that it had been taken down, because he did it on the side of a house. And then after he completed the mural, we realized that the owner of that land was going to build a structure and cover the mural up. So it's a little bit different. Some of the elements are the same, but it's just the changes in the built environment happen whether there's a mural there or not. And so I always tell folks, if you see something that you love, go ahead and just take a photo of it, because it might go away. Now, luckily, he was able to come back and do the second one. Yeah, it's just this one interpretation of history only lasted about 6 months. And it's very similar to the second mural, but just think that it could have been gone for good. So luckily we got him to come back and do the second one. So that's just sort of a little snippet of what I'm asking folks to do on tour, is just have a little bit of self-discovery. And since we're in a 3D environment, when we're doing the live tour, they can just, they can see the world around them. But virtually, they're sort of relying on what I'm showing them on screen. And so when I usually start a tour, this is where I start, looking at this image here. So the tour is called Art of the Black Broadway, and it's about how this area of U Street, or Washington, D.C., became known as Black Broadway, what happened during that time period, and my argument is why it doesn't exist anymore. So I like to start here. This is Howard Theater on T Street in Washington, D.C., and this is an image from, I think, this February, a couple of months ago. And it was one of several theaters in America on the East Coast that were known as the Chitlin Circuit. It was where all the Black artists could play safely, since we were massively segregated. So I'm from Richmond, Virginia. We had a theater called the Hippodrome. Washington, D.C. had the Howard Theater, which is here. Baltimore had the Royal. Philadelphia had the Earl. And New York has a famous Black theater. It's on 125th Street. Pretty famous. It's known as the Apollo. And all of those were sort of part of the same circuit. Now, Apollo is probably the most famous. It opened in 1934 in New York, but Howard Theater here in DC opened in 1910. Amateur Night at the Apollo, their most famous convention, they borrowed that from Howard Theater, something happening at Howard Theater. So for about 25 years, Howard Theater is the largest, probably top, most well-known Black theater in the United States. So just to give you an idea of where we are looking at Washington, D.C., where the theater is. So this map's a little busy, but it's a map of Washington, D.C., has a lot of the neighborhood names on it. And right in the middle, we're looking at the neighborhood called Shaw, S-H-A-W. That's where in DC this Black Broadway is located, or was located. So that's where Howard Theater is. It's about, just to give you a reference, maybe 2.5 miles from the White House, 2.5 miles north of the White House, just so you can place it. This is images. I love this image. This is the kind of place it was. This is an undated photo I sourced from the Smithsonian, but we think it's probably from 1936. And it's just an image of some newsboys who wanted to have their photo taken in front of Howard Theater. It was that sort of place. It was like a gathering place. I mentioned gathering places before. It's a place you want to have your photo taken in front of. And it's a place, people wanted to be. So that's sort of the kind of place the Howard Theater was and is. This is what it looks like today. It's a beautiful place right on T Street. But unfortunately, this is what it looked like for a long part of its history. So Howard Theater, it's in Washington, D.C. It's in the Shaw neighborhood. And in 1968, after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, DC had a series of uprisings and revolts. A lot of DC burned to the ground over the course of about a week. And Howard actually didn't get touched. The theater wasn't touched. But essentially, they just lost all their customers and they went out of business in about 1980. And the building went unused for about a 30-year period. Now, luckily, a developer was found about 15 years ago who converted this into this. And so he worked with the city to restore it to its 1910 origins. And so if you were a time traveler from 1910 and you fast forwarded to right now and you looked at the Howard Theater, it would look exactly the same that it did in 1910. Now inside it's, modern venue, entertainment venue, but on the outside they did a faithful renovation. So I appreciate that. So part of the tour is looking at just this one block, some clues that the city has given us to the history of the neighborhood. We've had the renovated theater. Another thing they've included on this same block, we have a statue of Duke Ellington. This statue is pretty new. I think it's from 2012, so it's only about 8 years old. But even in this image, you can see I'll allude to some of the things that I would be talking about later in the tour, which is we have these sort of historic homes in the background that were the row houses that are from 1890 to 1910. And then this is a very desirable neighborhood to live in. So we have massive residential units being added. And so you have a lot of sort of old and new next to each other. And that's sort of a characteristic of this neighborhood and a lot of Washington, D.C. So we have the Howard Theater. We have the Duke Ellington statue. Those are sort of two elements. If we were to walk next to Howard Theater, we have this great mural that's part of this murals program that DC has had in place for about 15 years. The program really started off as graffiti abatement. They thought that if we paid artists to complete beautiful murals that we wouldn't have any graffiti, but of course we still have graffiti, but this is one of the newer ones. It's called Jazz Heroes of Washington. And I won't go through everyone on here, but we have folks from Duke Ellington in the bottom left-hand corner, Billy Taylor, we have Ron Holloway with the saxophone, Michelle Indegacello. But I will mention, these are all sort of jazz-related artists, except for the woman in the top left, Mahalia Jackson. She's not a jazz artist, she's a gospel artist. And the image, the painting is called Jazz Heroes of Washington. She's not a jazz artist and she's from Louisiana. So why is she up here? So I love using this mural because it gives me sort of an entry into history that I can discuss with my guests. And so Mahalia Jackson does have a Washington link. She was at the March on Washington in 1963. And most people for March on Washington, you mention that and they think one thing: Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, which is true. But Mahalia Jackson was also there and she performed a song. And she was requested by Dr. King actually to sing there. And she was on, here's a program from the March on Washington. She went on a couple of slots before Dr. King. And when Dr. King came on, it was Mahalia Jackson that during his speech said something to the effect of, "Martin, tell him about the dream," giving him the inspiration to end his speech. And the way that he did ended up becoming one of the most famous speeches in American history, the "I Have a Dream" speech. So I love using this art, not just to talk about art, but to draw people into history. One other thing, which I'm not going to do now because I'm not allowed to play copyrighted music online, but with my guests, I do give them access to a playlist, which has some of the musicians that we discuss. So, it's, really try to make it it's multi-sensory, right? So we have this mural there's so many elements to it. I can't go over all of them, but we have the actual Howard Theater. We have the Duke Ellington statue. We have these murals, so that's 3. We also have these medallions that the city procured a couple of years ago from artists that they've embedded in the sidewalk. These are artists that have played Howard. They're not all from Washington, D.C., but that have played Howard theater over the years. So Marvin Gaye, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, there are quite a few of those, about 20 of those. And then the last thing I wanted to look at is this building here. So we have the Howard Theater, the statue, the murals, then we have the embedded medallions. And then last but not least is this building. Now, this is all on the same block. We haven't left the block. This building is about, I don't know, 50 yards from the Howard Theater. And I just want to examine the side a little bit. There's writing at the top. It's kind of small, so I'll read it. It says, 1893, Southern Aid Society of Virginia, 1920. Southern Aid Society was a Black-owned insurance company. Now, why am I mentioning this on the tour? Black Broadway was about music, musicians, music venues, but really, what was it about? Like, why did it come to be? And it came to be because Black people in Washington, D.C. were locked out of, the major institutions because of racism and discrimination. And so they had to start all over from scratch, including financial institutions, cultural institutions, educational institutions. So this building is a great example. Southern Aid Society was a Black-owned insurance company from Richmond, Virginia, my hometown. They opened in 1893 in Richmond. They moved their headquarters to this building in 1920. That's important because at the time, Black-owned businesses and individuals had a really hard time getting insurance, either personal life insurance or business insurance, which was necessary to run a business, from white-owned insurance companies. And so to have a Black-owned insurance company was massively important to building what became known as Black Broadway. And this is the 1890s up to 1920. The second thing they did, so they were providing this needed service, insurance for Black business owners and individuals and families. The second thing they did was they built their building too large for their own offices. Now, why would they do that? So they could lease out space to other Black businesses. So they're providing sort of a double service. I mean, look at their name. They were definitely 100% capitalistic for-profit company, but Southern Aid Society, they were about mutual aid. One of the businesses they leased out to was Dunbar Theater. You can still see the sign that's up there. That was a Black-owned movie theater. Now, none of this stuff exists anymore. The theater is a bank, and then the rest of the building is residential, but we got to save the building. So just to wrap it up, just on this one block, what are some of the things that guests can discover that we just discovered that allude to the history of Black Broadway? The Howard Theater itself. We have statues like the Duke Ellington statue. We have murals, multiple murals. We just looked at one. We have the Walk of Fame medallions. And then we have actual structures that sort of told the story of the neighborhood itself, like Southern Aid Society. So that's just a little snippet. The tour could go on for a whole semester, but we only have a couple minutes here, but I appreciate you giving me the time to do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that was so amazing, Tim. I feel like I actually did just walk around that block, and also a bunch of those things gave me chills, making those connections between history and the art and the physical space. So I want to back up a little bit though and ask you to maybe talk a little bit about your background and specifically how you came to see spaces like cities and other parts of the built world as learning environments.
Yeah, great question. I think part of it has to do with how I've worked after leaving university. So, I majored in political science, and one of the first jobs I had out of university was working at a children's museum, the Children's Museum of Richmond. And I wanted to work, in the political science part of the museum, which was they had this little store where you could practice, essentially like teaching kids how to be consumers. But I wanted to do a program about economics, but I ended up getting put into the fake cave science portion of the museum and also the art room. And so that sort of gave me a different perspective on watching and working with kids as they interacted in these spaces and with each other. Now, I actually came to DC to teach American government and civics, which is sort of really my dream job, right? And now I do this full time, the tours. But in between working as a civics teacher and being a owner of a tour business, for 10 years, I worked at the National Building Museum, which is a museum about architecture, construction, engineering, urban planning, the built environment. And during that time, I really got to focus on not just looking at how people interact with each other and, create a politic or solve problems, but also how they exist within the built environment, which is really, all built structures, including the space in between structures. So how people deal with each other, but also how they move within the built environment, but then also how they create it and maintain it. And all that stuff is intertwined. Like how you build the built environment is directly related to how you relate to other people, because no one can do it alone. And so through work, museum education, civics education, and then this last sort of period of my career of interacting with people in the city through walking tours, I think all of that combined sort of brought me to the place where I am right now.
That's really fascinating. Before the salon today, I know you were talking, I think, a bit with Amanda about the kind of the gap between what's actually taught in DC public schools about the history of the area and the city and what it actually is when you go out and look at it and you actually do the kind of deeper dives when you look into the buildings. I'm just curious if what do you see as some of the big blind spots or the failings of traditional education when it comes to understanding that kind of interdisciplinary space that connects politics and history, urban design, culture, all those things.
Yeah, great question. I mean, some of the stuff is just logistical, as in to examine the built world, you have to be out in the built world. And it's just often not possible to get students out, even sometimes like just outside the building for lots of different reasons, let alone like traveling to other places that are not there, where the students live. When I taught civics, I taught students from all over the United States and actually some international students as well that would come into DC. And I also taught students that were, here in Washington, DC. And one of the things I learned is Washington, D.C. is not that big. It's 60 something square miles. But we have a couple of natural barriers. We have a Rock Creek Park. We have a couple of rivers, Anacostia River, Potomac River. And I had students that were from upper Northwest that had never been to east of the Anacostia River, to some of the communities in Anacostia. And I had students east of the Anacostia River who had never been to like DuPont Circle, even though all these things are like 5 miles away from each other. And I think that's sort of indicative of like also a little bit what's happening in schools, because I think it's just not necessarily always possible to get people outside of the building itself, which I think is necessary. Also, I do think, other people have probably said this, and I'm not even sure how true I think it is anymore, but I think the attention on like strictly STEM is amazing. I think we've had great gains in understanding in science and whatnot, but I do think I would like to see more informal education around not just the hard sciences, but also like, in interdisciplinary fashion, bringing the built sciences, like the built, learning about the built environment into schools. And so that was one of the things I was trying to do at the National Building Museum, bringing things like bridge engineering or engineering against disaster forces, or urban planning, like planning for a green environment, trying to build educational kits in a way that teachers will be able to use those things and they can have real world applications, but you can teach them in school through K to 12. On the sort of the flip side of that question, I actually do think gains are being made. Like, for example, in Washington, D.C., the closest school to my house, I'm actually pointing at it right now, is Phelps Architecture, Construction, and Engineering High School. It's in Washington, D.C. And so it's a public school. It's a part of the DCPS system. And it's all about those three things: graduating students that are ready to go into schooling or a career in architecture, construction, engineering, and a little bit urban planning. So there are some deficits, but also I feel hopeful too that, our education systems as a whole, like the administrators, the teachers, like people are on board with like getting this interdisciplinary, way of learning. Like we're doing it. I think we are doing it.
Great, thank you. I didn't know about that school. I'll have to check that out. It sounds super interesting. Now, so thank you for sharing the walk part of the walking tour. I'd done that one with you, I think December. I can't remember if it was hot or cold when I went on the tour. And so I remember going on that block, and it is such a small area, but you're able to like really dive into so many different spaces and intersection of business and people's lives and history and everything. So if you could talk to us a little bit about like that transitioning from the building museum and then to like street walking tours and then to this online, and like how you've been thinking of different like great affordances, but then there's also different restrictions.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we are in a time of transition right now. I mean, probably everyone on the Zoom and everyone who's watching the Zoom on YouTube, like everyone's probably in a time of transition. That's right now in a lot of different ways. And I think when we're in a time of transition, it's sometimes a very like difficult, stressful time, an anxious time. And so you don't stop to reflect on how you actually are adapting right now to the new paradigm, or whether it's your job or school or personal life or whatever. And so, this last couple of weeks, I've been able to do that, to stop and reflect and say, in this time of transition, like, what did I actually do? Like, well, what did I actually change to get to where I want to be? And so, yeah, that's a great question. I think, stepping outside of the museum, museum ed, I love museum ed. I count it as an informal learning environment. But it does allow you to sort of have these touch points with traditional education, because you're always working with teachers. And so teachers are always sort of keeping me grounded in what direction we need to go for educating about the built environment, what aspects we need to include, how do we hook into other subjects and whatnot. But then when I left the museum to go on my own, I lost a lot of that. And so I had to sort of start in scratch and just figure out, wow, I've had all these resources and partners and connections to government agencies and, money. And on my own, had to figure out, well, how do I build this business in a way that I'm going to be able to attract the people I want to attract? And then how can I leverage what I have right now to be a good educator? And so, part of that was just figuring out, I was all built environment for 10 years. That's all I really was professionally. I wanted to leverage all of that and put that into my tour. So that's why a lot of the tours are sort of based on being in a space, examining the space, looking to the history of these spaces, buildings, even streets, infrastructure like the metro and transportation infrastructure and all that. So I didn't want to abandon that last 10 years of work and development and growth that I had. I wanted to include that into the tours. Transitioning from doing like a live tour to virtual was actually much more difficult, because so many things I relied on, I didn't even realize I was relying on them. So, for example, on the tour we were just talking about, you're standing in front of the Howard Theater. In a real world environment, I can reference things in the background, a vista off to a building in the background of Howard University. I can reference you to look all the way down T Street and see a neighborhood 6 or 7 blocks away. And so I can reference those things in real time and have people look at these vistas and create a narrative about the history of the neighborhood. I can't do that online unless I show every image from every angle, which is impossible. So part of the transition to designing an online tour is figuring out, how do I bring people into this space and make them feel like they know where they are, and then give them opportunity to, create this, world in their mind of this neighborhood in a way that they can have questions about it and want to be curious about it, and have it not just be, a lecture. And so that's sort of been the main transition, is when we're in the world, people they smell different things, they see different things, they hear different sounds, and that's part of the experience. Online, the only thing they have is what image I'm showing them on my share screen. That's it. That's all they have. And they can't really have music because I'm not supposed to play it online, but that's sort of all they have. And so that's been the challenge of, if I'm going to show them a set amount of images, like, whatever, 10, 20, 30 images, I have to make sure those images are going to help get the point across and help me create the narrative. So that's been the main challenge.
I appreciated how within the mural, like of just showing it from different angles and going between, because that's what you would want to do. Like I remember standing in front of that mural with you and going, oh, I want to look at it this way, or like move position a little bit. So I do think that you have created some of that like natural things that we do want to do, is get a little closer, move a little further back, go to the side.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
So,
sure
and can
that
I
took a lot playing around. Yeah.
Yeah, and can I follow up on that? And just I'll say that it's interesting, having never done one of your tours, Tim, and never been like anywhere near this block. I've only been to Washington, D.C. a few times. So it's like, it is actually kind of amazing how I did feel for a few minutes kind of transported there. I think that's pretty amazing. I'm curious, do you feel like there's any upside to the online transition? Because I know that you showed like some documents, the document from the March on Washington, you showed some things, and I'm wondering if you feel like, well, those are different affordances that you may not be able to do live.
Yeah, I would say the main advantage is, on a walking tour, the tour is 90 minutes and we cover about 1.1 miles. On an online tour, I can skip over to and show an image from the Lincoln Memorial. I can take someone from U Street to the White House in 0.1 seconds. And so, I had to actually break out of that mindset, because someone was asking me if, I could do a tour of the memorials. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, I don't know, because I only have sort of these images, and they were asking to do a tour about Lincoln. And I was like, wow, there's so much. And then it just clicked in my head. And I said, I could do a tour about Lincoln where we were at the Lincoln Memorial, and then we were at Lincoln Park, which is across town. And then we were at Lincoln's home, which is uptown. And then we were in Mount Pleasant. And we can go to all of those places online. Whereas in the real world, there's no way we could go to all of those places in 1 hour. It would be impossible.
Right. You have a rocket ship now. You can just beam.
Yeah.
There is one. Do you want to do the? There is one question from our people online, and it's kind of connecting to the curriculum around the built environment. So what would a curriculum around the built environment look like? Melissa's asking, like built sciences. What would it include? How would it connect to other curriculum areas? Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think in the past, what we've had success with is, bringing in the other disciplines simultaneously with them. So I'll give an example. So let's say we're talking about how to build a green, environmentally friendly community. I'll just say green because everyone knows what that means. You are talking about the sciences because I'll give one example. When you're building a green building, you want to have low VOC, low volatile. I just flew out of my head what it means. But anyway, low chemically laden materials when you build the structure. And you want to, so you're relying on science at that point. When we're talking about design for disaster, we're looking at basic lateral forces, shear force, gravity force. And you can start with that, the physical sciences. And so I think drawing people in is really just using traditional, curriculum around science or social studies or math, and then bringing them in that way. And then sometimes we had, at the Building Museum anyway, you could silo students to work on sort of different aspects and then bring them together to complete the whole. And so I think it really is sort of leaning on traditional subjects, traditional curriculum around social studies or science or math, and then using that to draw the students into realizing all of those are needed to create a green community or disaster resilient community. Or now we're talking about other things, the built environment. I think educators in the built environment and institutions in the built environment are really thinking about, well, have we been missing this other component, racial justice or economic justice, whichever component you want to talk about, and bringing that into the discourse about teaching about the built environment. And so I think now we're at a point where that question is a great question, because we're looking at that again, and we're always constantly looking at it, but we're looking at that right now. What does the curriculum look like? How is it equitable in all of these ways, or how is it not equitable right now in all of these ways? So yeah, always being looked at, and I hope the institutions are doing that as we speak, and I think they are.
That is hopeful. I hope they are too. You shared some tweets the other week we do some with the Talking About Design group. This also, I think Stephen mentioned it all came out of kind of a class, and originally we would have these like assignments to like point out like good and bad design, just to be thinking about how things are designed. And then sometimes we use things as they're designed, sometimes we use them in a different way, out of necessity or whatever, like kind of sometimes hacking other designs. I just muted myself. I'll share my screen to share your tweets about this idea of axis. And if you want to just talk to us a little bit, I also have one of the vistas, and if you want to talk about that too.
So I actually was earlier today talking about this. So this is probably not what you were trying to pull up, but it relates to the same topic. I was actually doing research and trying to get some images on some of the memorials downtown so I could actually create an online memorial tour. And I walked by this, and I had meant to write something up on this a couple of years ago, but just looking at this image, and it's not a bad design. I know we're looking for good and bad design. This is a good design, but we're just walking on 17th Street here, and on the right is a lock keeper's house. This is on Constitution Avenue in Northwest in Washington, D.C. This lock keeper's house is one of the oldest buildings in Washington, D.C. It used to be next to a canal, but now it's Constitution Avenue. It's a road. But anyway, the point is, lock keeper's house is a historic image, or historic building. And then in the same style, with the same type of stones, is this wall. And the wall is so interesting. It may just look like a regular wall, but if you look across the street, you see a continuation of that same wall next to the Washington Monument. And so what is this wall? It's a flood wall. And so what we've done, Washington, D.C., parts of downtown are pretty low lying. And so when we have, what they call a 100-year flood, a flood with, 1% probability it's going to overtake this area. It's very rare, but it does happen every now and then where it rains so much that downtown Washington, D.C., parts of it do get flooded, including important buildings like the National Archives and some of the stuff on the mall. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, DC agencies, a combination of agencies have worked together to build really flood defenses. And part of it is natural berms and risers, but also part of it is this wall. But to me, it's just so neat that even within building these flood walls, we've just sort of naturally sort of enveloped it into the historic part of the city. And so that we've even tried to match it, and you might not even notice it. And hopefully, we don't have to use these things often, but when we do, it's there. And so these are sort of design things I look for when I'm out in the city. And this kind of stuff is just fascinating to me. One of the images that we were going to be looking at was, and I'll actually see if I can pull this up, but one of the things I look for, and that we sort of discussed on the sort of tweet stream about good and bad design, was I'm obsessed with public seating. And I always look for places where either it's a public entity like the city has installed seating, or even if it's like a private business that has installed seating in a public area. And so I always look for where there is and where there isn't public seating. And so there's these two areas in Washington, D.C. in Northwest near the Black Broadway tour. One's on 7th Street and a block over on 8th Street. Now, 7th Street is where all the people were. They were just gathered, but there's no public seating. And so people have created seating. They sit on milk crates. They sit on the tree boxes. They sit on the ledges. But this is where the people gather. And over on 8th Street, it's sort of a newer construction of apartments and businesses and whatnot. There is a ton of new public seating, but no one's was on it. And so, I'm always obsessed with things like this, where we have a need for public seating in one space, clearly demonstrated by people wanting to sit down. And then we have an abundance of public seating in another place, but people just haven't really been sort of trained or used to it. So those are sort of the little design things that I look for and walking around the city. And that's what we're sort of getting at in these images.
That's really interesting. The things that you're noticing, and I'm going to shout out again to the Talking About Design group. We have a bit of an obsession with the 99% Invisible podcast, and they talked about hostile design and hostile architecture. It seems like what you're saying is also sort of just like the omission of design, or the omission of having certain features is kind of has a similar effect. So I do want to point out for everybody who's watching on YouTube, if anyone has any questions for Tim, we would love to hear from you. We still have quite a few things that we'd like to cover as well, but if anyone else that wants to share their questions in the chat on YouTube, please go for it.
I have a question. I popped in. I took over Amanda here. So I love this conversation about well, first of all, the built world and the curriculum around the built environment. And you were talking about that, and then you got into like seeing systemic racism in a way, like being able to see the racist elements of the built environment. And I just wanted to hear more about that. I thought that was a really interesting approach to helping people see what we mean by systemic racism. And I don't know if I have a specific question, but I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I'll see if I can pull up this slide that we were talking about just now. And that sort of, I guess, relates to this. I mean, part of the answer to that question is, it's sort of basic things like, if you have planning meetings, like you have to make sure working people can go to a planning meeting. If you have public meetings, you have to do enough public meetings in the neighborhoods where people can, you have to go meet the people there. And so I think typically, and I'll just use Washington, D.C., for example, actually I think we're pretty good at it here, but if you're having a public meeting about zoning in a certain area, like you can't have the meeting in City Hall. You really need to have the meeting, like meet the people where they are in their neighborhoods, and you have to have more than one, and you can't have it at 10 a.m. People are at work. And so I think there's sort of logistical things like this where meeting folks where they are and not leaving out segments of the population when we're actually planning these things. The image I just pulled up, this is the one we were discussing. On the left is 7th Street, that's the Southern Aid Society. And if you were to just walk down 7th Street, you do see people, I mean, you see there's a chair attached to a tree box. Like the need for seating is so strong here that people have just literally bought chairs and chained them to the tree box. Like there's a need for public seating. And so this neighborhood was, and I'm not actually sure, I'm curious to see the 2020 census to see what it looks like right now, but was a historically Black neighborhood, Black Broadway, we're just talking about it. But on the right side is an image of just one block over on 8th Street in an area that is on both sides, I would say structures that were built 2015 and later, brand new structures, largely more affluent, more white. And then the public amenities are sort of flowing, like here's public seating, more than you need. And so I think there are definitely, when we talk about, people want to talk about gentrification, yes, that is, part of that inequity is like an area becomes wealthier and whiter, and then they actually get more public amenities that when the area was not as white and poorer didn't have. And so that's not necessarily a planning thing. That's just really like city design. But, I think we're talking about the larger issue of like planning and single family homes. You have to take into account history. A lot of Washington, D.C. and other cities were, yes, redlined, but also there were other things like racial covenants, which essentially for some neighborhoods, racial covenant was an agreement that when you sold your home, if you're a white person, you sold your home, you wouldn't sell it to a black family. And a lot of places in Washington, D.C., you weren't allowed to sell it to a Jewish family either. And so, yes, we don't have racial covenants anymore. It's a thing of the past. But those shaped how neighborhoods looked for a long time. And so those things have to be acknowledged. So I think beyond doing the work of planning a city accessible, making the zoning of the city accessible, making rules about historic preservation, opening up those rules to the general public. I also think it's just a basic acknowledgement that the history in Washington, D.C. or wherever you are, or the United States, it still resonates today. So racial covenants don't exist, but those individual policies still resonate. And so I think it's really a holistic approach of acknowledging history, but also trying to do better. One other example I'll give is two things. I was just talking about this with Georgetown, the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., where a lot of African Americans, a lot of Black people in Washington, D.C. were able to own and maintain homes by boarding, creating boarding homes and renting out rooms. And then boarding was outlawed a couple decades ago. And so that took away this source of income for African Americans to own their homes. But nowadays, like, we have Airbnb and short-term rentals, and it's now allowed. And so it's just weird how things sort of come back. Another thing was alley dwellings. Many African Americans in Washington, D.C. lived in alley dwellings because it was cheaper and it was more affordable. And along the way, alley dwellings were outlawed. And so I think it's not as explicit now. Like, those sorts of things wouldn't be allowed, like outright sort of racist policies attacking, any one group just in plain day. A lot of times it's sort of coded or sort of shrouded in economic talk or whatever. But I think it's both those things. Yes, trying to bring the planning aspect to the people. So the built environment is not arbitrary. It's a result of human decision making. So bringing as many people into that decision making tent as possible, and then also just an acknowledgement of history.
Yeah, this is a really stark image. And I was actually going to ask you, I don't know if you could also, and this is something that maybe, we have, I think, about 5 minutes left to talk about, but the that other good bad design piece about the access to monuments. I also think that's a really fascinating design observation.
Yeah, I actually just skipped past it. Let me see if I can go back
to
it. So yeah, there we go. Yeah, I think, this one sort of hits you in the face a little bit, but when we think about the Jefferson Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial, the one you see on the left here, it's a heroic style. Some people would say, oh, it's a man and a horse. These two guys are on horses, but you have to make an effort to actually get to the chamber. And if you can't see inside the Lincoln Memorial, there's a statue of Lincoln inside the memorial. It's sort of like his house. But you have to work to get there. It's 87 steps from the reflecting pool all the way up. And when you get into the chamber, there's this great reveal of the actual statue itself. There's some great fresco paintings, and there's two speeches, the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural speech. And there's just this moment. Of course, the marble statue is beautiful. It's more beautiful at night, but it's really inaccessible. And there is an elevator, but last year for a long time, the elevator wasn't working. And so if you're a person that used a wheelchair or had mobility issues, what were you to do? And so contrast that to sort of newer memorials like the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial on the right. There's 0 steps to reach the memorial. As a matter of fact, it's more accessible than the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial. there's sort of this, reverence, like you can't touch the statues, stay away. In the King Memorial and I don't have a picture of this, but the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial, you can walk up to the statues, interact with them, take a photo with them, and there are no steps. There's no elevator needed. There are no stairs on the whole memorial, and so it's a more open, thoughtful design. And obviously, time, the memorial design changes over a 100-year period. I'm not saying that that's sort of obvious, but it is a thoughtful way to build a memorial where you want to have as many people be able to have access as possible.
Thank you so much. One question that came from our chat as well was, now that you're doing these virtually, how has that changed? Like the people, have you thought about like scaling up and reaching more people, or if people who are watching this want to get in touch with you and try to draw into the type of learning that you're offering, how can they do that? Leave it at that.
Yeah, it's been interesting. The guests, the audience, I've had to think about. It's a different audience, and it's an audience where they don't have to be in Washington, D.C. And that took me a couple of weeks to actually think about that and like realize that the potential is so much wider now. Whereas before, obviously, if I want to give a walking tour, the person had to be here. And a lot of people were coming for conferences, or they were looking for this sort of thing, or they always do walking tours. And so I sort of typecast, okay, this kind of person that's coming. Now with virtual, anyone can do it. And so, I typically like work with small groups. I work with individuals. I work with couples. I work with families. Anyone who wants to sort of meet me in that space. A lot of it I do just, through my website. I'll do it through, it's so interesting, like there's so many third-party vendors now, like Airbnb experiences, where you can't travel to a place, but you can still experience that place. And that's sort of the idea. And so I sort of meet people wherever they are, whether it's schools, whether it's individuals, whether it's couples, and I just deal with them one-on-one, or through a third party like Airbnb. But it's been like, really, I appreciate the question, because that has sort of been the secondary challenge, of not the challenge of how do I take a walking tour and put it online and make it a virtual experience, but then what's the secondary challenge is how do I find the people that may find this a valuable thing to be doing with their time.
So how can people find you and get in touch with you if they want to reach out and participate in this?
Great. I guess that would be important, right? If I want to be booked. The website is just the name of the business, which is Attucks Adams, so ATTUCKSADAMS, or you can just email me, tim@attucksadams.com. I'm on there too many hours of the day reading and responding to emails. And also a lot of the images that we've talked about, I do share on Twitter and Instagram. And so we've been trying to get having conversations on the social media platforms, and I'm on all of them under Attucks Adams. But even for folks that don't take a tour, I just love talking about all the stuff that we've talked about over the last hour in the public forum. That's really interesting to me. So at Attucks Adams, and also if you want to know the story behind the name Attucks Adams, I wrote up a little bit of it on the website, so I won't talk about it now, but it's one of my favorite parts of the actual business, combining these two people, Attucks and Adams, to form the name of the business.
I've been really curious about that, so I'm going to have to go look at it and see. And we'll put these details, we'll put the links in the comments to this. Once we post this recording video, we'll put the links in the comments for anyone who wants to reach out. Thank you so much. Stephen, do you have any closing remarks?
No, all I wanted to say is exactly pretty much what you just said, Melissa. This has been wonderful. Tim, thank you so much. I want to go on like all of your tours, and then I want to actually have you tour me around all of the other major cities in our country and point out these fascinating histories and connections. I will say, again, like Melissa alluded to, on talkingaboutdesign.com, we will be posting kind of like a debrief and a summary about this talk, and as well as I believe we're going to do the recording of the talk. So if you want to share this with other people who were not able to be here today, and come join the conversation, leave comments, and chat with us, chat with Tim on Talking About Design.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.